The fluorescent lights of the ER waiting room buzzed above me as I stared at the woman who destroyed my life 5 years ago. My sister Claire was dying. The doctor said she needed a rare blood type transplant, my blood type. And my parents, the same people who threw me out on the street without a second thought, were now on their knees begging. "Please, Marcus," my mother sobbed. "We know we made mistakes, but she's your sister. You have to save her." I looked down at them, and for the first time in 5 years I had all the power. The question was, would I use it? If you want to find out what happened next, stay tuned. And if you love stories of ultimate revenge and justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to True Revenge Tales, because this story will blow your mind. The story begins on what should have been the pinnacle of Marcus Chen's young life, a moment he had worked toward for 8 grueling years of undergraduate studies and medical school, his graduation party. Marcus had just graduated at the top of his class, from one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country, earning honors and accolades that most students could only dream of achieving. His parents had gone all out for this celebration, renting a beautiful venue, hiring caterers, and inviting what seemed like everyone they had ever known: extended family, neighbors, friends from church, colleagues from his father's work, and practically half the town. The house was packed with well-wishers, all eager to congratulate the young doctor who had made his family so proud. Marcus remembers standing in the center of the living room, wearing his best suit, accepting handshakes and congratulations from what felt like an endless stream of people. His father, typically a reserved and stoic man, couldn't stop beaming with pride, his hand constantly on Marcus's shoulder as he told anyone who would listen, "That's my son, the doctor." Always knew he'd make something of himself. His mother flitted around the party like a hummingbird, making sure everyone had food and drinks, but constantly circling back to Marcus, to kiss his cheek and tell him how proud she was. For Marcus, it felt surreal and wonderful. All those late nights studying, all those times he'd sacrificed going out with friends, all the stress and anxiety of medical school had finally paid off. In just 2 weeks, he was set to begin his residency at one of the best hospitals in the state, a position that had been fiercely competitive, and that he'd secured through his outstanding academic record and glowing recommendations. He was on top of the world, floating on a cloud of achievement and parental approval, completely unaware that his entire life was about to implode in the most devastating way possible. Then Claire arrived and everything changed in an instant. His younger sister by 3 years, Claire had always been the golden child of the family, the baby who could do no wrong in their parents' eyes. While Marcus had been expected to excel academically and build a career, Claire had always been indulged, her shortcomings excused, her desires catered to without question. She was beautiful, charming when she wanted to be, and had always known exactly how to manipulate their parents' emotions to get what she wanted. Marcus had noticed over the years a certain jealousy in her eyes whenever he received praise, a tightness in her smile when their parents boasted about his achievements. But he had never imagined she harbored the kind of resentment that could lead to what happened next. When Claire walked through the door that evening, arriving nearly 2 hours late to her own brother's graduation party, the festive atmosphere immediately shifted. She stumbled in with her mascara running in dark streaks down her face, her hair disheveled, her blouse torn at the shoulder, looking like she had been through something traumatic. The party chatter died down as people turned to look at her, concern and shock rippling through the crowd. Marcus's mother rushed to her daughter immediately, wrapping her arms around Claire and asking frantically what had happened. Who had hurt her? Claire stood there trembling, her eyes scanning the room until they landed directly on Marcus, and in that moment, he saw something flicker in her expression. Something calculated beneath the tears, but it happened so quickly he couldn't be sure. Then she spoke those life-destroying words in a voice that trembled, but carried clearly through the now silent room. "He attacked me. My own brother. He tried to..." She couldn't or wouldn't finish the sentence, before dissolving into what appeared to be inconsolable sobs, but the implication hung in the air like poison gas, suffocating everything good and pure about the celebration. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as every eye in the room turned toward him, the expressions of pride and warmth transforming instantly into horror, disgust and accusation. He tried to speak, tried to deny it, tried to make sense of what was happening, but his voice came out strangled and weak. "What? No! Claire, what are you... This isn't... I've been here the whole time." But his protests were drowned out by his father's roar of rage, a sound Marcus had never heard from his normally controlled parent. a sound of pure fury and betrayal that made several guests step back in alarm. "Don't you dare lie!" his father shouted, his face turning an alarming shade of red, the veins in his neck standing out as he advanced on Marcus with clenched fists. "Look at her. Look at what you've done to your own sister." Marcus backed away, his hands raised in a gesture of innocence and confusion, trying desperately to explain that he had been at the party for the past 4 hours, that dozens of people could verify he hadn't left, that this made no sense whatsoever, but rationality had left the room along with his future. His mother, still clutching Claire protectively, looked at Marcus with an expression of such profound disappointment and horror that it physically hurt, as if she were seeing a monster where her son had stood moments before. "I don't even know you," she whispered, and those words cut deeper than any scream could have. The party disintegrated into chaos, some guests leaving hurriedly, uncomfortable with the family drama, others whispering and staring, and a few actually confronting Marcus directly, calling him disgusting, asking how he could do such a thing. Within an hour, Marcus's belongings were being thrown onto the front lawn by his father, who had become a man possessed by righteous fury, deaf to any attempts at reason or explanation. Marcus stood on the sidewalk watching his life, literally being tossed away, his clothes, his books, his medical school diplomas still in their frames, everything landing in a heap like garbage. His father stood in the doorway, breathing hard, and delivered the final blow. "If you ever come near this house again, if you ever try to contact Claire, if I even hear your name, I'm calling the police and pressing charges. You are not my son. I don't have a son. Now get out of my sight before I do something I'll regret." Marcus tried one last time to plead his case to his mother, who had appeared behind his father, but she turned away, unable or unwilling to even look at him anymore, murmuring something about how she had raised a monster, how she had failed as a mother, how she couldn't bear to see his face. And Claire, the sister he had protected throughout childhood, who he had helped with homework and driven to parties and defended against bullies, stood behind their parents with her face buried in her hands, sobbing dramatically, not meeting his eyes. In that moment, standing on the street with his entire life in garbage bags, Marcus realized with crushing certainty that nothing he said would matter, that the truth was irrelevant in the face of his sister's tears and his parents' need to protect their golden child, and that his life as he had known it was over. 5 years passed like a slow, painful exile during which Marcus rebuilt himself from nothing, moving 3 states away to a small town where nobody knew his name or his shame, working grueling shifts at a modest clinic, while living in a studio, apartment that leaked when it rained, spending countless nights lying awake wondering how his own family could have abandoned him so completely, without even a shred of doubt or investigation into Claire's claims. He changed his last name legally, not out of spite but out of necessity, wanting to escape the shadow of accusation that followed him, and slowly, painstakingly, he clawed his way back up through sheer determination and skill, eventually becoming the head of emergency medicine at a respected regional hospital, earning the trust and admiration of colleagues who knew him only as the brilliant, dedicated Dr. Marcus Chen, who never spoke about his past or his family. He bought a modest house, adopted a rescue dog, and created a quiet life built on routine and professional achievement, a life where he didn't have to think about the parents who had thrown him away or the sister whose lie had destroyed everything he had worked for. And for the most part, he succeeded in building walls around those memories, locking them away in a part of his heart that he refused to visit. Then came that Tuesday night, the kind of unremarkable winter evening where Marcus had just fallen asleep, after a particularly exhausting shift, when his phone exploded with urgent ringtones at 2 a.m, jolting him awake with the familiar adrenaline surge that came with emergency calls. The head nurse's voice on the other end was tense and professional as she explained the situation. "Dr. Chen, we have a critical emergency situation. A patient just came in with acute liver failure. Toxicology shows years of alcohol abuse, and she's going to need a transplant immediately. But there's a significant complication with the case." Marcus was already pulling on his clothes, his mind shifting into the focused clarity that years of emergency medicine had ingrained in him, running through mental protocols for liver failure cases as he asked about the complication, expecting to hear about unstable vitals or complications from other conditions. What he heard instead stopped him cold in the middle of tying his shoes. "She has an extremely rare blood type and antibody profile that makes finding a compatible donor nearly impossible. We've checked the national registry, contacted every transplant center within 500 miles, and there's only one potential living donor match in the entire database." The nurse paused, and Marcus could hear the hesitation in her voice. the awareness that what she was about to say would change everything. "It's you, Dr. Chen. You're the only match. And there's something else you need to know. The patient's name is Claire Thornton, and her parents are already here in the waiting room, and they're asking for you specifically." The phone nearly slipped from Marcus's hand as the name hit him like a physical blow. All those carefully constructed walls crumbling in an instant, as 5 years of suppressed pain, anger, and betrayal came flooding back with overwhelming force, and he had to sit down on the edge of his bed, struggling to breathe, struggling to process the cosmic irony of this moment. His sister, the person who had destroyed his life with a calculated lie, was dying, and he was apparently the only person on earth who could save her. And his parents, the parents who had believed the worst of him without question, who had thrown him out like trash, who had cut him out of their lives so completely that he hadn't received so much as a birthday. Text in 5 years were at his hospital, in his territory asking for his help. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of conflicting emotions, Marcus's hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white as his mind raced through the implications. The questions, the sheer absurdity of the situation, and when he walked through those emergency room doors and saw them, sitting in the waiting area, he almost didn't recognize them at first, because they had aged so dramatically. His mother, who had always been so proud of her appearance, looked like she had aged 20 years. Her hair completely gray now, her face drawn and haggard, her eyes red and swollen from crying, while his father, once so strong and intimidating, sat hunched over with his head in his hands, his shoulders curved in defeat, looking smaller and more fragile than Marcus had ever imagined possible. When they looked up and saw him standing there, in his white coat with his hospital ID badge, the complex emotions that flickered across, their faces in rapid succession, recognition, shame, desperate hope, overwhelming relief, and crushing guilt, would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so devastating. His mother stood up shakily, reaching toward him as if he were a ghost she couldn't quite believe was real, whispering his name like a prayer. "Marcus, oh God, Marcus, you actually came." And there was such raw need in her voice that it made something twist painfully in his chest. But Marcus forced himself to remain cold, professional, channeling all his hurt into an icy composure as he stated flatly that he worked here, that this was his hospital, and asked what had happened to Claire, with the detached tone he might use for any patient's family member. His father stood then, seeming to gather himself, before explaining in a broken voice that Claire had been struggling with alcohol addiction for years, that her liver had finally given out, that the doctors had told them she needed a transplant immediately, and that Marcus was the only compatible donor they could find, and the way he said it, with such desperate, pleading hope, made Marcus want to laugh bitterly at the irony. "Convenient," he said, the single word dripping with 5 years of accumulated bitterness, and he saw his father flinch as if struck. But before either parent could respond, his mother grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging in as she poured out a frantic plea about how she knew they didn't deserve to ask him for anything, how she knew what they had done was unforgivable. But Claire was dying, his sister was dying. Didn't that matter at all? Marcus pulled his arm away sharply, his voice rising despite his attempts to maintain professional detachment as he asked how she dared call Claire his sister now, after that sister had destroyed his entire life with a lie, after his parents had thrown him out without even asking for his side of the story, without even a moment of doubt or investigation, and now they wanted him to literally give a piece of his body, to save the person who had caused all this suffering. The waiting room had gone quiet, other families and patients watching this drama unfold. But Marcus didn't care anymore as 5 years of suppressed rage began to surface. And then his father spoke the words that made the entire world tilt on its axis. "We were wrong, Marcus. We were so terribly wrong about everything. Claire told us the truth 2 years ago. She admitted that she lied about everything, that none of it ever happened." The words hit Marcus like a freight train, stealing his breath and making his vision swim as he processed what his father had just said, his voice barely a whisper as he asked, "What?" And his mother collapsed into sobs, explaining through her tears that Claire had been jealous, insanely jealous of his success and the attention he was receiving at the graduation party, that she had wanted to hurt him and had fabricated the entire accusation out of spite and vindictiveness, and they had been trying to find him for 2 years, but he had changed his name and moved and covered his tracks so well. 2 years? Marcus heard himself say, his voice strange and distant to his own ears. "You've known for 2 years that you destroyed an innocent person's life, and you never tried hard enough to find me? I'm a department head at a major hospital. I'm not exactly in hiding." His father tried to explain about shame, about not knowing how to apologize for something so catastrophic, about the paralyzing guilt that had consumed them both. But Marcus cut him off as a nurse appeared, asking if he was willing to undergo donor compatibility testing, and his parents looked at him with such raw, desperate pleading that it made him sick. And in that moment, with all the power suddenly in his hands, Marcus realized he had to make an impossible choice between the person he had been and the person he had become. Marcus sat alone in his office, for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, staring at Claire's medical file spread across his desk. The clinical language of liver failure and toxicology, reports somehow making the situation feel both more real and more surreal at the same time, and he found himself caught in a mental and emotional war between two very different versions of himself. The wounded, abandoned son who had every right to walk away and let karma take its course, and the healer who had taken an oath to save lives, regardless of personal feelings or past grievances. Claire was in room 237, sedated but stable for now, her body systematically shutting down as her poisoned liver failed to perform the basic functions necessary to sustain life, and according to the transplant team's assessment, she had perhaps 48 hours before the damage became irreversible and fatal, which meant Marcus had 2 days to decide whether his sister lived or died, a godlike power he had never wanted and certainly never imagined, having over the person who had destroyed his life. Part of him, the part that still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night, with phantom pain from those early days of exile and rebuilding, wanted desperately to refuse, to let them all feel the helplessness and despair they had made him feel, to watch them realize too late that actions have consequences and that some betrayals are too deep to ever be forgiven or forgotten. And he could already imagine walking away, leaving the hospital, maybe even taking a few days off to avoid seeing any of them, letting nature take its course, while he told himself it wasn't really his responsibility to save someone who had shown him such callous cruelty. But there was another voice in his head, quieter but more persistent, the voice that had driven him to become a doctor in the first place despite all the obstacles, the voice that had made him stay in medicine, even after his residency position was stolen from him, the voice that reminded him he had taken an oath to do no harm, and that deliberately withholding life-saving treatment was itself a form of harm, regardless of how justified his anger might be. He thought about all the patients he had saved over the years, people who probably didn't deserve saving, people who had made terrible choices or hurt others, and he had never once considered their worthiness before treating them, because that wasn't his job. His job was to heal, and if he made an exception now, if he let personal vendetta override his medical ethics, what would that make him? Finally, he stood up, his decision made not out of forgiveness, but out of a determination not to let Claire's actions turn him into someone who could watch another human being die when he had the power to prevent it. And he walked through the quiet hospital corridors to room 237, pushing open the door to find his sister awake, barely, her skin carrying the yellow tinge of jaundice, her eyes sunken and glassy, looking like a ghost of the vibrant, manipulative young woman who had destroyed him 5 years ago. When Claire saw him standing there, tears immediately began streaming down her face, and she whispered his name followed by an apology, so raw and broken that it almost didn't sound like her voice at all. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry for everything I did to you. For the lie, for ruining your life, for being too cowardly to tell the truth for so long." Marcus sat down in the chair beside her bed, his voice calm and clinical as he asked the question that had haunted him for 5 years. Why did she do it? What could possibly have motivated her to tell such a devastating lie about her own brother? Claire closed her eyes as if the shame was too much to bear while looking at him, and she explained in a halting whisper that she had been spoiled, cruel, and consumed with jealousy, that everyone at the party was celebrating him and talking about his achievements while she felt invisible and unimportant, that she had thought their parents would just be angry with him for a while, maybe ground him or yell at him. But she hadn't anticipated they would actually throw him out, and then when they did, she had been too scared and too selfish to admit the truth, letting him suffer for 3 years before her guilt finally became unbearable enough to confess. "You let me lose everything," Marcus said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "My career, my family, my reputation. 3 years of hell before you even admitted what you'd done." And then another 2 years where our parents knew the truth, but apparently couldn't be bothered to find me and apologize. Claire nodded weakly, more tears falling as she said something that surprised him. I know I'm a terrible person and I deserve this. I deserve to die for what I did to you, and I'm not asking you to save me, Marcus. I have no right to ask you for anything, but our parents have been destroyed by what they did, by what I made them do to you. And if you decide to do this surgery, don't do it for me. Do it so they don't have to lose another child because of my mistakes. Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, studying this broken version of his sister, seeing perhaps for the first time that her suffering over the past 5 years, though different from his, had been real in its own way, a prison of guilt and self-loathing that had driven her to destroy herself with alcohol. And he realized that his revenge, if he had wanted it, had already happened. Claire had been punishing herself far more effectively than he ever could. He stood up and delivered his decision with quiet finality. I'll do the surgery, but not for you and not even for them. I'm doing this because I refuse to let your lie turn me into someone who can watch a person die when I have the power to save them. I'm doing this because I'm better than all of you. The surgery was scheduled for the next morning, and it went exactly as planned, with Marcus donating a portion of his healthy liver while Claire's surgical team worked to transplant it. And though there were tense moments during recovery, Claire's body ultimately accepted the organ, meaning they had both survived the procedure that had bound them together in the most literal biological way possible. During Marcus's recovery, his parents maintained an almost constant vigil by his bedside, and it was during one of these quiet moments that his father revealed they had sold the family house, the home where Marcus had grown up and from which he had been so brutally expelled, and were using the money to establish a fund in his name to help students who had been wrongly accused of crimes or misconduct, unable to undo what they had done, but determined to spend the rest of their lives trying to make some kind of amends. His mother added, her voice breaking, that they didn't expect forgiveness, didn't expect to be part of his life again, but just needed him to know that they understood the magnitude of their betrayal and were truly, desperately sorry for choosing to believe the worst of him. Without question or investigation, Marcus looked at these people who had given him life, but had also nearly destroyed it. These flawed humans who had failed him in the most fundamental way parents can fail a child, and he spoke a truth that was both painful and liberating. I don't forgive you, not yet, maybe not ever, but I'm willing to start over. Not as your son, but as Marcus Chen, a person you're just getting to know. And if you can respect that boundary and not push for more than I'm ready to give, maybe someday we can build something new. Something based on honesty rather than blind faith. His mother broke down completely at these words, sobbing with what seemed like equal parts grief and gratitude, while his father simply nodded, unable to speak, but clearly understanding that this conditional offer of potential reconciliation was more than they had any right to expect. As for Claire, when she recovered enough to communicate clearly, she did something that Marcus genuinely hadn't anticipated. She wrote a detailed, unflinching confession of everything she had done and posted it publicly on social media, tagging every family member, every friend, every person who had turned their back on Marcus 5 years ago, telling the complete truth about her false accusation and accepting full responsibility for the destruction she had caused. The post went viral within their extended family and social circles, and Claire faced the same kind of social exile and judgment that Marcus had endured, losing friends who couldn't believe her cruelty, losing her job when her employer saw the confession, losing her reputation and having to live with the label of being someone who had falsely accused her own brother of assault. And Marcus watched this happen with complex feelings, not quite satisfaction, but a sense that justice was finally being served. Some people who read her confession called Marcus a saint for saving her despite everything. And these comments always made him uncomfortable because he knew he wasn't a saint, wasn't even particularly forgiving. He had simply made a choice to act according to his values rather than his pain, to be a doctor first and a wounded brother second. 6 months after the surgery, Claire entered a comprehensive rehabilitation program and began intensive therapy to address both her alcoholism and the deep-seated jealousy and insecurity that had driven her to such destructive behavior. And she began sending Marcus letters, not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation, but simply updating him on her progress, taking full accountability for her actions, sometimes including copies of exercises from therapy, where she had to examine her motivations and the harm she had caused. Marcus didn't always read these letters immediately. sometimes letting them sit on his desk for days before opening them, but he never threw them away. And occasionally he would send a brief response acknowledging receipt, maintaining a distant but not completely closed relationship. He didn't know if he would ever truly forgive his parents for their catastrophic failure to trust him or support him when he needed them most. Didn't know if he could ever look at Claire without remembering the moment she destroyed his life. But he did know with absolute certainty that saving her life had been the right choice, not because she deserved it, but because making that choice had allowed him to remain true to the person he had fought so hard to become during those 5 years of exile and rebuilding. Sometimes, Marcus reflected during quiet moments, the best revenge isn't making others suffer or watching karma destroy them. It's refusing to let their betrayal and cruelty destroy the fundamental goodness and integrity that defines who you are. And in choosing to save Claire's life despite everything she had done, he had saved something even more important. He had saved himself from becoming bitter, vengeful, and consumed by the very darkness that had nearly destroyed him, proving that sometimes the strongest act of defiance against those who wrong you is simply continuing to be a good person despite every reason they've given you to become otherwise.